Hey everybody, Tim Albrecht here, and welcome to this week's episode of the Ask a YFP CFP segment of the Your Financial Pharmacist Podcast, where we feature questions from you, the YFP community, to be answered by one of YFP Planning's fee-only certified financial planners. Before we jump into today's question, I want to give a shout out to YFP Planning's team that makes this segment possible. YFP Planning offers fee-only comprehensive financial planning that is customized to the pharmacy professional. So whether you want to optimize your investing plan, pay off your student loans, or simply build a solid financial plan, YFP Planning will help get your income working for you rather than the other way around. You can learn more by visiting yfpplanning.com. Again, that's yfpplanning.com. Okay, Tim, this week's question comes from Brian, and he asks, I am set on paying off my student loans, about $200,000, as soon as possible after graduation in May of 2023. I want to live as cheaply as possible for a few years in order to do this. I've been wondering if I should buy a newer vehicle or keep my current one that has needed a few repairs in the last several years. I have driven a 2008 Honda Civic since high school and really want a truck. I live in Texas and enjoy going camping and hiking on weekends, and this would make this lifestyle more feasible and enjoyable. I do not think I would buy a new truck off the lot, but would get something made within the last 5 years. I'm weary if an extra $500 to $700 per month truck payment is smart given my amount of student loans. My parents say I deserve a truck to reward myself after so many years to become a pharmacist, but on the other hand, I don't want extra debt hanging over my head. I don't know what to do. Should I buy a newer vehicle to enjoy my outdoor hobbies or continue to drive my Honda Civic and use that money that would go towards a truck payment to my student loans? I'm estimating at about $5,000 per month. I could have my student loans paid off within 3 to 4 years with refinancing them. Tim, lots going on here. Long question. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I and typically the one that says, you have to, weigh the present with the future. And I think there's a lot of things going on here, and it kind of gives me pause. So, when you're saying things like, I'm weary of an extra $500 to $700, and I don't want the extra debt hanging over my head. And then you kind of splice that with my parents say I deserve it. I think that if you're already having these feelings, I think it's kind of a way to say out loud that probably that purchase of a truck that's going to cause a $500 to $700 payment is not ideal. Typically most people that are all in on paying the loans off as quickly as possible are not going to couple that with a car note that of that magnitude. So although I know that, lifestyle wise, having a truck and doing that is important to you, I also think that it's going to come into conflict with what your overall goal is. So I would just weigh those two things really. And it sounds easy to do. And I know it's not, because you're kind of outlining, both sides of the argument. But, for me, I think if you're already kind of putting up some of the, the drawbacks, I just think that it's probably not going to be worth it. And I would say, sticking your head down for 3 or 4 years, which might be less if you think that you do have room for maybe it's a $5,500 payment, which is a lot of money. But to me, obviously, if we go back to the student loans, is it the case that doing the all in,
Right.
selling an organ, living off of ramen noodle, if that is the right approach? Because sometimes people just go there because they don't want to wait, say, 10 years for forgiveness or something like that. Yeah. And what I'm saying is, let's not make that assumption out of the gate, because sometimes it comes to the conclusion with clients is that you should definitely look at a forgiveness option and pay $700, $800 a month versus $5,500, and then so I would say don't assume anything. Look at all the options, but if it does come back to the the all-in very aggressive stance on the student loans versus buy a truck, and maybe it's not a 3 to 4 year, maybe it is a true 5, which I think anything under 10 or under is fine. I think where people get borrowers get in trouble is they're like, oh, like I can't do, because at $200,000, you're talking about probably a $2,200 payment, at a standard 10-year. So I think where people look at that, they're like, oh, I can't do 2,200. So they go the opposite way and they look to pay it off in 20 years or 25 years. And I don't think that's advisable either. So maybe there is a middle ground that you feel comfortable, maybe at a 7-year or even a true 5-year, and you give yourself a little bit of grace to for the truck. But I would also challenge you. And again, this is coming from somebody who has a ridiculous size RV, and it's not even camping, it's glamping, but you can go camping out of a Civic. That is something that you can do. So it's not necessarily an all or nothing. But I would just feel, terrible for you if you feel like you were talked into it. I deserve it. And now you have that debt hanging over your head in your words. And maybe you're just not enjoying it as much as you could because you're like, okay, what could those dollars, be put to? So, it's a tough one, but at the end of the day, we see this a lot too, and this isn't even just for younger pharmacists. I think it's for any stage of life, is that people have an opinion about your financial plan and like, oh, Tim, you're making 6 figures, so why aren't you driving that luxury vehicle, or why aren't you living in that big house? And the fact of the matter is that your financial plan is yours. So if your parents want to make a $500 to $700, donation for the cause, that would be great. But at the same time, like, these are real dollars that are coming out of your paycheck, and you want to deploy them in a way that you feel meet what your ultimate goals are. So, and it sounds like taking camping trips are part of the game plan. But it also sounds like so is the aggressive loan payoff. So first, I would say, don't assume anything with the loans. You want to look at all the different strategies that are available to you, and then optimize the strategy that does make sense for you. But then, stick to your guns about your financial plan. Don't, sometimes we'll say like, oh, like my colleagues are all doing this. And I'm like, well, one, they're wrong. And two, they're not necessarily, that's not necessarily your financial plan. So, don't get caught up in that herd mentality either. So, that would be my advice is look at all options and then live your own plan. Don't get caught up in what everyone else is thinking about you or doing.
Yeah, that's great stuff, Tim. And I'm glad you addressed kind of the question behind the question, right? Which is, do I have the right loan repayment plan, in play for all the reasons that you mentioned? And Brian's got, if I'm doing my math right, he's currently on his last year pharmacy school, will graduate in spring of 2023. So he's got some time to kind of really work through this, especially with the grace period, after the graduation before active repayment begins, and really taking that step back of, you gave a great example of $200,000 of a public service loan forgiveness pathway versus an aggressive repayment, as was outlined here in this question. Easily the difference of several $1,000s a month, of what's coming out of pocket. So maybe here PSLF is not even a play or an option. And maybe at the end of the day, we get to the same, or Brian gets to the same conclusion of aggressive payoff, whether that means refinance or not. But I think really answering that question first is so important. And then as you alluded to, Brian, my encouragement would be is there option C and option D to consider? So, Tim mentioned, hey, camping out of a Civic could be done. Maybe not what you had in mind, but, does the experience still remain? Or, is there an option I'm thinking of sites like Toro that are out there that you rent a vehicle for, some of those special weekends, and you still save, significantly on owning the vehicle. But are there other creative solutions out there that can accomplish the same task, but not necessarily, have you left with some of those feelings and anxieties that we see in the question? So great question, Brian. Really appreciate you taking time to send that in. And we're going to be sending you a super comfy YFP t-shirt as a small thank you for submitting your question. And to those listening, we'd love to hear from you with your question. You can ask that by visiting yourfinancialpharmacist.com/ask-YFP, where you can record your question, or you can also send us an email at info@yourfinancialpharmacist.com. As we wrap up this week's episode of the podcast, an important reminder that the content in the show is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. For more information on this, you can visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thanks for listening and have a great rest of your week.